simply, if you could get inside the mind of the publisher in terms of how they felt about price increases, you can learn a lot about the durability of the economics of a business by observing the behavior of the price behavior. I mean, you're seeing that. We're talking about the beer business. The beer has moved up in price every year, but there have been some rollbacks in certain areas in the last year, which means that it's getting a little bit more difficult to increase prices, even though they increase them at rates below inflation. And that's not a good economic sign. Charlie?
I have nothing to add to that.
Okay, we'll go to number 7.
My name is Pete Banner from Boulder, Colorado. First of all, Mr. Buffett, Mr. Munger, we shareholders consider you our heroes. We appreciate and very much value who you are and what you do in the world. So thank you.
Well, thank you, Pete. And I will say in return that we think we've got the best group of shareholders in the world, and to some extent it's evidenced by the fact we have the lowest turnover, and I think the most knowledgeable group, incidentally, too, of shareholders. So with that, our mutual love affair can go on.
Thank you very much. Secondly, with taxes as they are today, 15% on dividends, how do you feel about declaring a dividend?
Oh, you were setting me up. Well, there's no question about the fact that dividends are lightly treated now for taxation purposes. But we have always said, and it's been true, that if there were no tax on dividends, to this point at least, we would have followed an identical dividend policy, because the test with us is whether we think we can retain a dollar and have it worth in present value terms more than a dollar. If we can't do that, we should distribute any money that we can't utilize on that basis. Now, when the cash piles up like it has currently, you can say it's pretty dumb to hold billions of dollars that last year the rates were less than 1% after tax. And what are you doing for shareholders with that? And I would say that the burden of proof will certainly shift if within a few years we can't use a lot more money intelligently than we are now. But if we were, at the time at which we feel that the present value of the earnings we retain is not greater than a dollar comes, and it could come, and it's more likely to come when you get large like we are, then we should have not only a dividend policy that's X% of earnings. We should pay out very substantial sums. The test is whether the money can be used effectively within the business. So far, it has been. That doesn't mean it was yesterday or the day before, but so far, it's produced more than a dollar's worth of market value for every dollar retained. But that will be discussed. Our directors meet Monday. That will be discussed then, and you're certainly, if we sit here a couple of years from now and we have not successfully deployed more cash, then I think that the burden of proof has shifted dramatically to us to explain why we would be retaining earnings at that point. Charlie?
I've got nothing to add to that, too.
Number 8.
My name is Ole Larsen from Salt Lake City, originally from Sweden. I read your annual report where you mentioned how the current account deficit or the trade deficit has to eventually come to an end. And in your report, you were reluctant to give views or forecasts of how this would come down from $2 billion a day. Would you nevertheless be willing to share some thought of how it might come down, if you have any views on this?
Well, that really is a $64 question, because we are, in my view, and Charlie doesn't, he's not as on board on this as I am, so it's important that you listen to him on this too. But it does seem to me that a $618 billion trade deficit and a larger current account deficit, rich as we are, strong as this country is, that something won't happen that will change that in a major way at some point, and that the longer that it goes before changing, the more likely it is that something fairly significant happens. But most economists or most observers would still say that some kind of a soft landing is possible, or they would say it's likely. They never, to my mind, they never quite explain, what the soft landing is. They just say it's likely to be a soft landing, but it could be something different, but we still think it'll be a soft landing. But I don't know what a soft landing is exactly, in the sense of how the numbers come down quite significantly. And if they don't come down, the current account surplus or deficit means that we are transferring more and more wealth abroad, and that we will, in addition to our trade deficit, we will at some point have a very significant deficit in terms of the net investment position that the rest of the world holds on it. So it becomes a compounding effect. I do recommend there was an op-ed piece in the Washington Post on April 10th by Paul Volcker, and he has expressed himself some on this, and he gets into the question of whether it can be a soft landing or not. But I think he certainly expresses some real apprehension about whether a soft landing will be the likely result. In the kind of world we live in, with so much of the assets of the world, whether they be foreign exchange or whether contracts or whether they be stocks or bonds or junk bonds or whatever, I think as high a percentage is on what I would call a hair trigger now as it has ever existed. In other words, I think there are more people that go to bed at night with a position in foreign exchange or bonds or a carry trade or stocks or whatever, that some event that could happen overnight would cause them to want to change that position in the next 24 hours. I think that's the highest perhaps in history. Somebody's referred to it as the electronic herd that is out there. I mean, people they can give vent to decisions involving billions and billions and billions of dollars, with the press of a key virtually. And I think that electronic herd is at an all-time high. I think that some exogenous event, it was almost long-term capital management in 1998, but some exogenous event, and we will have them, will cause it. I think it could very well cause some kind of stampede by that herd, and that you can't get rid, if you're the rest of the world, you can't get rid of dollars. I mean, if you're sitting in Japan, China, or someplace, and you own a lot of U.S. government bonds, if you sell them to somebody in the United States, you get U.S. dollars. So you still have U.S. assets. If you sell them to somebody in France, you've now got euros, but they've got the government bonds. You can't get rid of those assets, but you can't have people trying to head for the door very quickly with them under certain circumstances. Volcker said in this thing, he said in the second paragraph, yet under the placid surface there are disturbing trends, huge imbalances, disequilibria, risks, call them what you will. Altogether, the circumstances seem to me as dangerous and intractable, and I don't emphasize intractable, as any I can remember, and I can remember quite a lot. Well, Paul Volcker can remember quite a lot. And I agree with that. I have no idea. I have no idea on timing whatsoever. In economics, it's far easier to tell what will happen than when it will happen. I mean, you can see bubbles develop and things, but you do not know how big the bubble will get, for example. This happened 5 years ago in the market. So predicting timing I've just never been successful at it, nor do I try to do it. Predicting what will happen, I think, is a much easier sort of thing. And I would say that what is going on in terms of trade policy is going to have very important consequences. It was not addressed in the last presidential campaign by either candidate in any meaningful way at all. Now, I'm not sure if you were standing up in front of the American people and somebody's giving you 3 minutes to explain this whole situation, when 90% of your audience couldn't define current account. It's not an easy game, but it's an important one. Now, Charlie is less enthusiastic about our foreign exchange position somewhat than I am. So I want to yield the floor here for a significant period of time while he gives you the other view.
Well, I'm, if anything, a little more repelled than you are by the lack of virtue in the way our nation uses consumer credit and the way we run the public finances. And I have a feeling that eventually a lack of virtue is going to hurt one. Where we differ is that I agree with Adam Smith that a great civilization has a lot of ruin in it, meaning it will bear a lot of abuse. And so I think there are dangers in the current situation that make it unwise for anybody to swing for the fences. But I don't think that we have a certainty that the system won't stand a lot more of the kind of abuse it's getting now.
What do you think the end will be?
Bad.
I knew I could count on him. We are truly in this country like an incredible. We are truly in this country like an incredibly rich family that owns, we'll say metaphorically, millions of acres of land. They can't travel to the outer reaches of their domain, but nevertheless they sit on the front porch and wait for the produce to come in from this vast holding, and when they get it all, they still want to consume about 6% more than everything that's been produced on the farm. And they have the ability to do that by simply selling off a little piece of the farm every day and every year that they can't even see. So they don't feel any poorer at the end of the day or at the end of the year, because it's still, as far as their eyesight can see, they own everything that God ever created. And they can sell that little piece, or they can mortgage it. They can send IOUs to these people that are giving them the extra goods to consume. And we are a very, very, very rich family, and we produce a whole lot, and we consume a little bit more than we produce. And we trade away a little bit of the farm or put a little bit of a mortgage on every day. And the rest of the world is happy to take a little piece of our farm or take a mortgage on it. A little harder to send us something so that we can consume a little bit more than we produce. It's been going on a while. It's accelerated a lot in the last few years, and more the rest of the world is owning part of us, and we are going to have to service that ownership either through interest if they took it in IOUs or in some other way. And it can go on a long time, but if it goes on a long time, the world will own a good bit of us, and our children will be paying one way or another for the fact that we got to consume more than we produced. And it could happen. You've obviously had some less interest in the rest of the world accepting dollars by the fact that the dollar's declined somewhat in value in the last few years. In other words, interest in the rest of the world accepting dollars by the fact that the dollar's declined somewhat in value in the last few years. In other words, that the investment in us is always going to be equal to the overconsumption. I mean, it's an equation. But if people get a little less enthused about one side of the equation, it reflects itself in the pricing mechanism. And the world has demonstrated a diminishing enthusiasm for dollars in the last few years as they get flooded with them, because we send $2 billion out every day, whether we like it or not, and whether they like it or not. Now the question is, does that reach some tipping point at some point, or does some exogenous event come about that causes people to want to rush for exits? Who knows? I have a hard time thinking of any outcome from this that involves an appreciating dollar. But as Charlie will point out in just a second, there have been times when we've been surprised. Charlie?
Yeah, the counter argument is that what does it matter if the foreigners own 10% more of the United States if at that time total wealth of the United States is 30% higher than it is now? And so
Well,
the people who have that point of view just roll with it. And some of them think that if we didn't manufacture anything in the United States and just sat here running hedge funds, we would have a wonderful economy because it comports with Republican principles.
We could cut
I
each other's hair
disagree.
too, actually. I mean,
Yeah.
but back in the late 18th century, obviously, the idea of taxation without representation caused a certain amount of trouble, and ownership of the rest of the world by the rest of the world of this country would be seen as a form of taxation, I think, 20 years from now by the people who resided here. If instead of fighting the Revolutionary War, we'd simply made a deal with England and said we'll give you 3% or 5% of our national product forever, and you let us be free, and we'll just send the royalty over every day. That might have looked like a good alternative to war, in 1776. But I don't think that subsequent generations would have reacted well. I mean, something would have happened over time, and I have a feeling that the idea of America paying tribute to the rest of the world because of the overconsumption patterns of a previous generation seems to be, I don't think that's a particularly stable scenario, but that's why we have only $21 billion in foreign exchange contracts. Charlie might have a little less, or maybe none, if he were running it entirely, and I might have somewhat more if I didn't know I'd have him sitting up here next to me next year. Let's go to number 9.
Hello, my name is Johann Freudenberg from Germany. What do you think would be the consequences of a strong decline of the housing market for sales of carpet retailers and manufacturers? Thank you.
Well, if there's a strong decline in the housing market, my guess is that whatever we lose in carpet we'll be making up for somewhere else, because it would, a lot of the psychological well-being as well as the financial well-being of the American people is tied up with the fact, or comes from the fact, that they feel so good about what has happened with their home ownership over the years. And with many people, it's been by far the best behaving asset that they've had. So if there is indeed some kind of a bubble and it's pricked at some point, my guess is that we would feel that in various ways in our operating businesses, but that in terms of what we could do with our capital, with the net effect of Berkshire might well be quite positive. We're not big on macro forecasts. I mean, this foreign exchange thing is quite different than what we've done over time and the way we've made money. So it isn't like we've got some great track record of predicting macro factors and have made a lot of money doing that. We've made money by looking at things like PetroChina or whatever it may be and just deciding that here's a very good business that's selling at a very cheap price. Certainly at the high end of the real estate market in some areas, I mean, you've seen some extraordinary movement, and I've referred to this before, but 25 years ago or so, we saw the same thing in farmland in Nebraska and Iowa and surrounding areas. We had people running from cash. Cash is trash, and people were, they were worried about the fact that inflation was out of control in the late 70s and before Volcker did his stuff. People were fleeing from cash, and one of the ways they gave vent to that fear was to rush into farmland. And there was a farm about 30 miles north of here that sold for about $2,000 an acre in roughly 1980, and a few years later I bought it from the FDIC for $600 an acre. And you can say, how can you go crazy about farmland? It's going to produce about 45 bushels an acre of soybeans, about 120 bushels an acre of corn, and there's no way you could dream about it tripling or the internet causing corn yields to go up or something of the sort. But people went crazy on it, and the consequences were huge in terms of banks failing, lots of banks failing in this area. Banks that had gone through the Great Depression, but they just went a little crazy. People go crazy in economics periodically in all different kinds of ways. And, you had the Resolution Trust Corp come out of the savings and loan nuttiness that took place in real estate, where they financed everything that was put before them. And I will not. I don't know where we stand in terms of the residential housing cycle, and it has different behavior characteristics simply because people live in the houses in great many cases. So will not behave necessarily the same as other markets. But when you get prices increasing at far, far greater rates than construction costs or inflationary factors, sometimes there can be some pretty serious consequences. Charlie?
Yeah, it's in a place like Omaha, there's not much of a housing price bubble, is there, Warren?
No, there's not been a bubble, but I would say that residential real estate probably has increased in price at a rate quite a bit faster than the general inflation rate.
Yeah, but if you get to Laguna, California, or Montecito, California, or the better suburbs of Washington, D.C., you have a real asset price bubble. I have a relative that to move to a good school district in the suburbs of Virginia, she'll have to pay 4 times as much as she can get from selling her nice Omaha house.
Yeah, well,
that's a price bubble.
I sold a house a few months ago in Laguna for $3.5 million. Now, it sold the first day, so I probably listed it too cheap. So don't count on me for residential real estate advice. But that house, the physical house would probably cost $500,000 or thereabouts. So in effect, the land went for $3 million implicitly. And the land is probably on the area of 2,000 square feet, which is a little less than 1/20th of an acre. Now you've got streets and all that sort of thing involved. But basically, I think that land sold for about $60 million an acre, which that fellow that you saw in the farm outfit in the movie sounds like a pretty fancy price for almost any kind of land. Charlie, you've witnessed it firsthand, though, out there.
Well, yeah, there's one of the Berkshire directors lives adjacent to what I regard as a pretty modest little house, which sold for $27 million recently. Now, these are houses that look right at the ocean, and there isn't a great deal of available shoreline in California, and there are a lot of people. But you have some very extreme housing price bubbles going on, and you would think there might be a real possibility that it could go in the other direction someday.
At $27 million, I'd rather stare at my bathtub. Yeah. Number 10.
David Winters, Mountain Lakes, New Jersey. How do you try to manage risk at Gen Re and National Indemnity to be comfortable and maximize returns? Especially, how do you prevent a catastrophic loss or unexpected correlation? Thank you.
Yeah, well, that's a very good question, because we are doing things in different parts of our insurance operation where there is correlation. And there's not only correlation among the insurance risks. I mean, just take a really major earthquake in California in the wrong place. There have been about 25 6.0s or larger in the last 100 years, but most of them don't occur where a lot of people are. But if you get the wrong one in the wrong place, it would not only hit National Indemnity and General Re, as you mentioned, but it might very well have a severe effect on Seas Candy. It might very well have a severe effect on Wells Fargo. We don't own Freddie or Fannie now, but we owned Freddie at one time. It could have had a severe effect on Freddie. It can have all kinds of secondary and tertiary effects that you might not think of initially. So we find when there's trouble, everything correlates. And it's part of my job is to have at least a general idea of the sort of risk that the various enterprises might be running operationally, and then integrate that into my own notion of the risk that we run in terms of investments, in terms of all kinds of things. And that is my job. The most likely mega cat at any time is a hurricane. I mean, we have more exposure to that. On the other hand, if you're talking 25 billion and up, maybe 100 billion and up insured catastrophes, a quake might be just as likely as some force 5 hurricane that would come in at the wrong place. But my job is to think absolutely in terms of worst case, and to know enough about what's going on in both investments and operations to make sure that no matter what happens, I don't lose sleep that night, over whether there's a 9.0 quake someplace or whether there's a force 5 hurricane that actually goes up the East Coast and enters at places that very seldom does it enter. Long Island, for example, a huge amount of exposure. How often is Long Island going to, really have a major hurricane? Not very often. I think there was one back in the 30s, but there were potato fields there in the 30s, and now there's all kinds of insured value. And everything that can happen will happen. I mean, in terms of what we know of history in this country, last 300 or 400 years, the most severe quake by far was at New Madrid, Missouri. And who would have guessed, that quake would happen? And there were 2 subsequent quakes. They're far enough apart so they didn't exactly seem like aftershocks. All 3 of those were higher than 8 on the Richter scale. Nobody thinks about that, but they've had them in Charleston, South Carolina. You will see things, maybe not in your lifetime, but if you take the centuries, some extraordinary things can happen. And it's Berkshire's job to be prepared absolutely for the very worst. And by and large, I would think hurricanes and quakes are the biggest thing now. But a few years ago, we did not have nuclear, chemical, and biological risks excluded in policies, and we had huge exposure subsequently gotten rid of. But we take on large risks. I'll give you a couple of examples. Just the other day, and nobody else will write this stuff, basically, because they would want to reinsure it with somebody else, and they're not set up to do it. But one large international airport came to us, and we wrote a policy for $500 million, excess of $2.5 billion from any action that was not caused by nuclear, chemical, or biological sources. So if that airport is taken out in some way, but not by nuclear, chemical, or biological activities, the first $2.5 billion somebody else worries about, and we get the next $500 million. There's a sublimit, so only $1.6 billion can be counted for business interruption. So you would need, and that airport would have to be out for a couple of years to have $1.6 billion of business interruption. So you need $900 million of physical damage on top of that. But somebody is willing to buy that policy, and there's a real risk. We insured the NCAA Final Four down in St. Louis against being canceled, not postponed, or having the games, those Final Four games, moved to another city. But if it was canceled totally, and again, not through nuclear, chemical, or biological, we would have paid $75 million. Same thing, again, not through nuclear, chemical, or biological, we would have paid $75 million. Same thing at the Grammys. I mean, we take on risks that very few people want to write, but in the end, we're willing to lose a lot of money in one day, but we're not willing to do anything that causes us any discomfort in terms of writing checks the following morning. Incidentally, while I'm on the nuclear, while we're talking about the pleasant subjects, I recommended in the annual report that book, Nuclear Terrorism, and if you go to lastbestchance.org, you can obtain, or will soon be able to obtain, a tape free that the Nuclear Threat Initiative has sponsored, which has a dramatization of something that is now fictional, but it's not fanciful. It's something that could happen, in which the Nuclear Threat Initiative is working to minimize the chances of. And on that program, in addition to this dramatization of what could happen in that field, you have Sam Nunn and Senator Lugar with Tom Brokaw discussing the subject. It's an important subject. It didn't get a lot of attention again in this last campaign, although I think both candidates fully recognize the importance. But we would regard ourselves as vulnerable to extinction as a company if we did not have nuclear, chemical, and biological risks excluded from virtually all of our policies, although we intentionally take on the risk periodically, but only in an amount that we feel we can handle. We do not write it and give it away for free, and we do not want to write it promiscuously, because there could be events happen that would make it impossible for our checks to clear the next day, and we're not going to get ourselves in that position. Charlie?
Yeah, we're likely to do better than most other people in dealing with what concerns you. We care more about it, that kind of correlation. We just naturally have minds that think about tidal waves in California where they've never had one in modern California civilization. Can you imagine what a 60-foot tidal wave would do in California? There's nothing physically impossible in having a 60-foot tidal wave in an earthquake zone which California is in. But it's never happened in modern history. But it's the kind of thing that we do think about. And do you think any other company has as much and as rigorous nuclear and so on exclusion as we do?
Well, nobody's attacked it any more vigorously than we've attacked, I would say.
Yeah.
I mean, what you have here is, individually, we probably worry more about the downside than just about any manager you can find, and collectively, it's Armageddon around here every day. But that's, we care about that. We've never used a lot of borrowed money. Back when I started out, I mean, I had $10,000, but I just didn't want to borrow any significant amount of money. There's no reason to. We're living fine. We were living fine when I had $10,000, and the idea that you risk what you need and is important to you for something that you don't need and is unimportant is just craziness. And we try to run Berkshire that way. And I had a 98-year-old aunt, my Aunt Katie, that died last year. She had everything she had in Berkshire. And the idea that I should be doing something to try and add a few dollars to my net worth or a few percentage points to the record and be risking the fact that she would go back to Social Security is, I think that's kind of crazy for a manager. But, maybe if I had a 2 and 20% arrangement with my Aunt Katie, I'd be differently, but I hope not. Number 11.
Hello, my name is Martin Wiegand from Chevy Chase, Maryland. On behalf of the assembled shareholders, we appreciate you and the Berkshire staff hosting this weekend and would like to thank you for building this community of shareholders.
Martin, thank you. I should point out that I dated Martin's aunt, but she only went out with me once. But maybe you could explain that, Martin.
New board member Bill Gates has been talking about education reform in America. And columnist George Will quoted you in an article about Patrick Burns' efforts to reform education in America. Could you share with us some of your thoughts about these two efforts, or your efforts to reform education? Thank you.
Well, interestingly enough, we just dedicated a school here in Omaha yesterday, which is named after my Aunt Alice, who taught in the Omaha Public Schools. And I think we've maintained quite an excellent public school system in Omaha. We also have an outstanding parochial school system here. It takes the interests of parents, and frankly, it takes the interests of the well-to-do in the school system to keep a first-class school system. I've said that to some extent a good public school system is a lot like virginity. It can be preserved but not restored. In Omaha, we've preserved it, but you preserve it by having the parents interested and involved in the public school system. And Patrick's got an ingenious idea to make sure that more of the money goes to teaching and less to administration and overhead. There's a variety of ideas around about how to correct a system where it's broken. And Charlie, as a big Ben Franklin enthusiast, has always said that an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, and I think we've been spending that ounce of prevention, or providing it here in Omaha. I think it's Charlie will have a lot more to say on this. I admire the fact that people like Patrick and Bill Gates and a lot of other people, John Walton and Teddy Forsman, all kinds of people, Bob Wilmers up in Buffalo, are attacking the problem. It's probably the next to the nuclear, chemical, and biological problem. I mean, it's the number one problem of the country is making sure that the educational system is the best in the world. We've got the resources, and we're not providing it. We're not delivering it. So it's very complicated when you operate through thousands and thousands of school districts, and you work with many, many unions, and you've had, to a great extent, in many areas, the rich opt out of a system and set up a separate system. I am not as concerned about the public golf courses in Omaha as I might be if I played them every day instead of playing at a country club. And if you have a two-tier school system, one for the rich and one for the poor, it's going to be hard to pass bond issues that benefit the people that don't have the money to send their kids to private schools. I'm a big believer in the public school system, though, in terms of equality of opportunity in this country. And, Charlie's thought about education. He's actually come close to running a school, cares about it enormously, so I'll turn it over to him.
Well, I learned something rather interesting about Omaha Public Schools on my way to this meeting. I stopped to sign some books in a warehouse in South Omaha, and one of the very nice people in the warehouse was married to an 8th grade teacher in the Omaha Public Schools. And we got to talking about No Child Left Behind, and he said his wife, this 8th grade teacher, had a very interesting system. For the numerous children who couldn't read, she records books on tape, speaking slowly in her own voice, and when some children are reading the books, other children are listening to the tapes, and that way the children who listen to the tapes are not left out when they ask questions about what went on in the books. Well, this is No Child Left Behind in a sense, but it's also failure in a sense. And I think it's very hard for a civilization to fix the situation once somebody is in the 8th grade and can't read. So I think there's a lot of failure, even in relatively advantaged places like Omaha. And it's very serious failure. We never should have allowed it to happen.
Yeah, my friend Bill Ruane, who is here, I believe he's here, is doing something extraordinary in terms of a program he has teaching kids to read. In fact, journalists are here should seek out Bill and learn something about the story of what he's done in the last 10 years in terms of moving reading abilities and kids' enthusiasm for reading, which is more important because it's I talked about our managers, and the important thing is that they have a passion for their business. Well, passion for reading can be developed, and Bill is showing that in programs that I think he first started them in Harlem. He sort of adopted a block up there and went from there. And he would be a very interesting fellow to get some views from on this subject. We've had this great success story in this country, and a lot of it is because of people have had something closer to equality of opportunity in the United States than they've had in most parts of the world. And you do not have equality of opportunity when my kids get to go to some school where I can attract outstanding teachers and where they're in the company of other kids that are also motivated and they're getting encouraged at home and all sorts of other things, and somebody else who is born into a less advantageous family really doesn't have a chance. They go into something that's close maybe to an armed camp and where the teachers are just sort of pushing them through. and there's no stimulus from the other kids except to do things that are counter to the interests of society. And that just isn't a situation that really should be allowed to exist in a country where the GDP is almost $40,000 per capita. Let's go on to number 12. Oh, incidentally, I have to make one. It was mentioned about Bill Gates being a director, and I got a little survey here that came out. Price Waterhouse and the Financial Times cooperated on the survey, and they asked CEOs around the world to choose, if they could pick anybody to choose from history or today to join their company's board, who would they choose? And I'm happy to report that Bill came in number 2. And actually number 3 was Winston Churchill. Carlos Ghosn came in 4th. Jesus Christ came in 5th. Napoleon Bonaparte was 6th. And I won't give you the rest of the list. But
who was one?
Well, one was Jack Welch. I knew you'd ask. But we didn't ask Jack. We asked Bill. So actually, I thought this was quite an interesting list because I think many of the CEOs of the world would prefer people that are dead to be on their board.
It's too funny.
Now, let's see. Where were we? We're going to number 12.
Hello, my name is Robert Peyton from Chicago, Illinois. And on that note, maybe a merger of some sorts between Berkshire and Microsoft is in the works.
I keep hinting, but it doesn't do any good.
The question that I have is, do you think the shift in the banking system during the 90s to finance home purchases with 0% down impacted the overall savings rate, as home purchases are the largest investment most people make, and the overall rise of home prices driven by these marginal buyers? If so, how would you suggest that we correct the problem?
Yeah, of course, anytime a home is constructed, it represents somebody's savings. I mean, the home buyer may buy it for nothing down, but that means he's borrowing 100% of the mortgage through a mortgage that somebody else has saved somewhere, maybe intermediated 3 or 4 times or something of the sort. But home construction comes about through savings. Now, there's no question that terms have become easier and easier, and I've talked to certain mortgage bankers about this subject, but terms have become easier and easier as prices have increased. Now, that is absolutely counter to, how people think about lending in general. Generally, the more the asset class becomes inflated, the less a prudent banker will lend. But of course, in this country now you have mortgages intermediated in a way that the person buying the mortgage, in the case of, I'm thinking of Freddie and Fannie and other forms like that, so we're about the lower priced houses, but the mortgage buyer does not need to care about what kind of mortgage, what kind of a financial transaction the purchase is. All they have to do is look at the guarantee, and they look at that rather than whether somebody's put any money down or anything of the sort. So I think you've had easy financing facilitating a boom in real estate prices, even at the higher levels, and I think that which has occurred in other asset classes in the past. I mean, that farm bubble I talked about was facilitated by the fact that banks in small towns, who generally have been very conservative in lending, went crazy around 1980, and they lent amounts that the farm itself could never repay. They started saying a farm was an asset appreciation investment, not an income investment. And once you talk about something that's an asset appreciation investment, ignoring the underlying economics of what you're lending on, you're really talking about the bigger fool game. You're saying, that this is a silly price, but there'll be a bigger fool that comes along. And that actually can be a profitable game for a while, but it's nothing that bankers should engage in. So I would say that easy lending obviously does contribute to overall in the country to a lower savings rate. But in effect, somebody has to save for somebody else to borrow. And what is happening now is the rest of the world is saving, so that in the U.S., in global terms I'm talking, but the rest of the world is saving, and they're sending us $2 billion. I mean, we're sending them, in effect, claims or ownership of $2 billion. They're investing $2 billion a day in the United States. But a lot of economists will say, well, that's what's really going on. The world loves our assets so much, and they have so much confidence in America that the present current account deficit is driven by the fact they want to invest. I don't believe that at all. I think it's just silly, frankly, to make that argument. They are investing because they have to, because of our consumption habits, and not because they want to. And I think the declining dollar is evidence of that. Charlie?
I've got nothing to add to that. It's obvious that the easy lending on houses causes more houses to be built and causes housing prices to be higher, probably, in the new field. Eventually, of course, if you construct enough new anything, you can have a countervailing effect. In other words, if you built way too many houses, you'd eventually cause a price decline.
I'll give you a fanciful illustration. Let's just assume that Omaha had a totally constant population. No one was allowed to leave. No one was entered. Birth rate equal death rate, all of that sort of thing. So the population was constant, and nobody could build any more houses. We just passed a city ordinance to that effect. But every year, everybody sold their house to their neighbor. So first year, everybody sold their $100,000 house to their neighbor, and they both switched houses, and that was fine. And then the next year, they agreed we were going to do it at $150,000. And you can say, well, how could that be? Well, we would all go to Freddie or Fannie and get our mortgages guaranteed for a larger amount, and somebody in New York or Tokyo or someplace would buy the Freddie or Fannie paper, and we'd have an influx of $50,000 per household. We'd all have the same number of houses. We'd all be living one house to a family, and we'd have marked up our houses, and we'd now have a bigger mortgage, but we'd have $50,000 more of income that year just to service a little higher mortgage. And we do the same thing the following year for $200,000 and so on. Now, that would be very transparent, and people might catch on to the fact there was something funny going on in Omaha. But you can have an accidental aggregation of behavior that somewhat leads to the same effect. And if you keep marking up something, and in the process, the payment for the marked up price comes from someone else who feels they are bearing no risk because they've got the government guarantee in between, the money can just flood in, and everybody feels very happy for a long time. And we don't have anything like the fanciful thing I set forth in terms of Omaha, but we have certain aspects of that, I think, going on in the economy. Charlie, I'm throwing this one at you, would you agree or not?
Yeah, I do agree with that. You have buried Ponzi effects in various parts of any modern economy, and they're very important, and they're very little studied in economics.
Let's try number 13. I think maybe that's in the other room, and we'll see whether we get a response, and if not, we'll...
Good morning, Mr. Buffett and Mr. Munger. My name is Martin O'Leary, and I'm from Austin, Texas. Mr. Buffett, given your past essays concerning the U.S. dollar and foreign exchange forward contract holdings that you have, and many countries' economic policies that have a tendency to debase their currencies, do you think that gold can be considered a viable investment alternative to paper currencies?
Yeah, we're not enthused about gold. People historically have felt that was the first refuge from a currency that was going to be decline in value. But, so's a barrel of oil, so's an acre of land, so's a piece of Coca-Cola, so's See's candy. See's candy, if the dollar goes down 50%, we will be selling See's candy for double the present price. We'll be getting the same real price for See's candy. People will work the same number of minutes or hours per week in order to buy a pound or a 2-pound box of the candy. So we would much prefer some asset that is going to be useful, whether the currency is worth what it is today or 10% of what it is today, or whether people are using seashells in order to transact business, because people will go on eating and they'll go on drinking and doing various things, and their preferences will translate in real dollars into more or less the same economics for us. And we would not trade the ownership of those kind of assets for a hunk of yellow metal, which has very little real utility except for people who are looking to flee from the dollar and in our view really haven't thought through the consequences of what fleeing would where they should flee. Charlie?
Yeah, if you have the opportunities of Berkshire Hathaway, averaged out, gold is a dumb investment.
My dad was a huge gold enthusiast, so I sat around the dinner table. My two sisters are here too. They will testify to it. We sat around listening to the virtues of gold, and that was in, we'll say, 1940. And gold at that time was $35 an ounce, and we would have had some storage and insurance costs. And here it is, 65 years later, world wars, nuclear bombs, all kinds of things, and the compound rate from $35 to a little over $400, less those expenses, is not something that causes me to salivate. Number 14. Do we have a second microphone in the overflow room? Oh, there's only one in there. Okay, then we'll go back to number 1.
Andrew Noble from England. Apart from the catastrophic insurance events or Armageddon scenarios that you've been talking about earlier, in relation to the operations of Berkshire Hathaway, what are your greatest fears?
Well, the greatest, I would say, we don't worry about the economics of the businesses we have. We've got a very diverse group. By and large, they're very good businesses. By and large, they're run by some of the best managers in the country. But we worry about something going wrong. I mean, you heard about the Solomon thing in the movie, and I mean, we've got 180,000 people out there, and I'll guarantee you something is going wrong someplace as we talk. That's just the nature of it. But what you hope is that it's relatively unimportant, or that we catch it, but that's that is something that we know will happen. We try to have a culture that minimizes that, and I think we do have a culture that minimizes that. It's very important in our view to have the right incentives, and many places we think have incentives that aren't so good. I mean, when I get on an airplane and we own the company like NetJets, the last thing in the world I want to tell the pilot is that I'm running late and I hope we can get to New York a little faster. I mean, that is dumb to incent a pilot who may be worried that, somehow you affect his job or something, to get in a hurry about the takeoff or the checklist or whatever it may be. And companies do that time after time in their compensation plans or things that they incent people, in our view at least, to some of the wrong things. That doesn't mean nothing wrong will happen under any circumstances, but you should not have a system that causes people to, for example, worry about quarterly earnings. None of our managers do not submit budgets into Almo. I have no idea what we're going to earn next quarter, and I have no implicit body language out there or anything of the sort to our managers that I'm hoping to earn X dollars per share in the quarter, because in the insurance business particularly, you can report any numbers basically that you want to if you write long tail business for a short period of time. And we've got 45 billion of loss reserves. Well, who knows whether the right figure is 45 billion or 46 or 44. And if the desire is to report some given number in a given quarter, instead of saying 45 billion, you say 44.75 billion or something of the sort. So we have no incentives in terms of how people are paid, or in terms of the fact they just don't want to let me down. Let's assume at the start of the year I asked everybody to submit budgets, and then I went out in Wall Street and preached a bunch of numbers. Even if their compensation didn't depend on it, the managers would feel, we don't want to let Warren down on this, so we'll take an optimistic view of reserves. And that's easy to do at the end of the quarter, and we won't let him down, and then he won't look like a jerk in front of Wall Street. So we try to avoid that sort of thing. But even then, that is what we worry about. We don't worry about this place making money. I mean, we'll make money, and if we don't, it's my fault. And that's not the problem. The problem right now, in addition to the one we just talked about, the problem is deploying capital, and that's my job too. And I haven't done a very good job of that recently, but with a little luck, we will, in a different kind of market situation, we will get a chance to do that. Charlie?
Yeah, well, if you stop to think about it, the history of much of which we don't like in modern corporate capitalism comes from an unreasonable expectation communicated from headquarters that earnings have to go up with no volatility and great regularity, corporate earnings, I mean. That kind of an expectation from headquarters is not just the kissing cousin of evil, it's the blood brother of evil. And we just don't need that blood brother in our headquarters.
Businesses do not meet expectations quarter after quarter and year after year. It just isn't in the nature of running businesses. And in our view, people that predict precisely what the future will be are either kidding investors, or they're kidding themselves, or they're kidding both. And Charlie and I have been around cultures, sometimes on the board, where the ego of the CEO became very involved in meeting predictions which were impossible really over time. And everybody in the organization knew, because they were very public about it, what these predictions were, and they knew that their CEO was going to look bad if they weren't met. And that can lead to a lot of bad things. You get enough bad things anyway. I mean, but setting up a system that either exerts financial or psychological pressure on the people around you to do things that they probably really don't even want to do in order to avoid disappointing you. I mean, I just think that it's a terrible mistake, and we'll try to avoid it.
Is largely innate. So if these characteristics are inherent, and you were to attempt to consistently identify future great managers or entrepreneurs before there's a track record, how would you go about doing it? And in particular, could there be a way to know that before someone's made a lot of money, before they've built a business that they love and feel passionate about, that they will develop those types of qualities later in life?
That's a terrific question, and we have dodged it largely over the years by actually buying businesses from people where we've seen the record. In other words, I'm not sure I can go, in fact, I'm quite sure I can't go to an MBA class of 50 and sit down and talk with each one, examine their grades, examine their extracurricular activities, and whatever, talk to their parents. I'm not sure I could rank those 50 very well in terms of their potential for future business success. And of course, some of it would depend on what areas they entered into in business. So I think it's tough. I think it's tough to go out to the practice tee where people are not actually hitting balls but just taking practice swings and say which one is a 2 handicap and which one's a 15 handicap and which ones can make it on the tour. I think I can tell a little bit maybe, but it's very hard to calibrate. And I don't think we've had much success, but we also haven't tried very much to identify people before they've had a record, to try and identify the ones that are superstars. Instead, we've taken the easy way, and we go and somebody comes to us with a business that's done phenomenally for 10 or 15 or 20 years, or maybe for 50 years, and we've seen what their batting average is. We've actually seen they batted .350 or whatever it may be in the major leagues, and we just make the assumption that we won't screw it up by hiring them. And we also make the assumption that they'll live to be 100 or 120 or something, and we buy the business. And that's far easier. It is far easier to tell the great baseball batters after you've seen a couple seasons of their batting than it is to go to college, even college baseball teams or high school baseball teams, and pick out the superstars. The one interesting thing, and I wish I could remember where I saw this study, and it may not even be a valid study, but I do remember seeing something many years ago where they tried to correlate business success with various variables. And they took grades in school and whether they got MBAs and all that sort of thing. And they found that the best correlation was with the age at which they started their own business first. The people that got very interested in starting lemonade stands or whatever tended to have better, that tended to correlate better with business success than other variables. We have found ourselves, we've got a lot of MBAs running businesses for us, but they ran them for a long time before we hired them or before we made the deal. And we've got others that never set foot in a business school. And I do think there's a lot to wiring. I think there's also a lot to working with the wiring you have and developing it over time. I don't think it's all innate, and I don't think you can't improve. I know you can improve on what you're given at birth, but I do think an awful lot of it's wiring, more so than I would have thought 30 or 40 years ago. And I've certainly seen it in business. There are people, no formal business training. Charlie never went to business school. But he thought about it. I never heard Charlie say anything dumb about business yet, except when he disagrees with me. The truth is, I've never heard him say anything dumb about business, period. And there are other people. I've never heard Tony Nicely say anything dumb about business, ever. They're wired so that it doesn't flicker. They get the answers. It doesn't mean they can, they'd be a great ballroom dancer or a great baseball player or, a great politician, but they are wired for business. Charlie?
Yeah, part of it's intelligence and part of it is temperament. I don't know if Bill Ginn is in the audience, but by the time I was 14 years of age, I knew Bill Ginn would be rich. He was a classmate of mine in high school. He was a very intelligent man, and he wanted to be rich. And he was sensible in the way he handled life. I think sensible people with the right temperament and the right intelligence, if they live long enough in our system, will get rich. But temperament is, I think, to some extent inherited too, don't you?
Yeah. His daughter, incidentally, is a partner with my daughter in a knit shop, which I hope you patronize while you're... We've united again and the Buffett family. Charlie, when did you first think business was something of interest to you?
Very early. I loved games of chance.